Hello and welcome to my channel. The title of this video is An Introduction to the Spanda Karikas Part 2, Section 1, verses 12 through 24, and Section 2. Introduction. This video is the second on the subject of the classic tantric text, the Spanda Karikas. The study is intended as introductory to familiarize the viewer with the text and basic concepts of Tantra and Kashmir Shaivism. It is not exhaustive, and those who wish to pursue these matters further are referred to the primary text that I have used, which are noted in the links below, as well as other resources. This includes a free PDF of the full text of the Spanda Karikas, the Divine Creative Pulsation by Jaideva Singh. All the verses from this book used in this study are posted below for the viewer to review or follow along. As is my custom, I will cite all quotes used in this study in the notes below, which are visible if the viewer will click Show More beneath the video. I would also repeat, as always, I make no claims of authority, and I am simply representing to the viewer my own study as it stands. It is for you to reach your own conclusions based on the sources given and your own research and critical thinking on these matters. The text, Section 1, verses 12 through 25. Verses 12 and 13. Quote, "Mere non-existence cannot be an object of contemplation, nor can it be said there is no stupefaction in that state, because, on account of the backward reference, it is certain that it, i.e. the experience of stupefaction, was there in that state. Hence, that artificial object of knowledge is always like sound sleep. It is not in this manner, i.e. as a state of recollection, that the Spanda principle is known." Unquote. These verses are predominantly polemical against both the followers of Advaita Vedanta and the Buddhist. The goal of both of these meditative practices in their different manners is the attainment of fundamentally a void state. To quote the Chinese Zen master Pang, quote, "Old Pang requires nothing in the world. All is empty with him, even a seat he has not. For absolute emptiness reigns in his household. How empty indeed it is with no treasure. Be not surprised at emptiness, though thoroughly empty, for emptiness is the seat of all the Buddhas, and emptiness is not understood by the men of the world, but emptiness is the real treasure. If you say there's no emptiness, you commit grave offenses against the Buddhas." Unquote. We see a bit of the paradox of Buddhism here, reflecting its inherent inconsistencies. If all action and all objects are empty, how can one offend the Buddhas when both they and one's active denial, and indeed oneself, are all equally empty? In reality, nothing is happening. So why create something which is a layer of illusion on a non-existent ego then, with an emotional response of offense? The reasoning at the core of the tantric view is to ask, how can such an experience of total extinction exist when it is predicated on the disillusion of the contemplator as well? Otherwise, it is not truly a void. The second point of these verses is the claim that those who have experienced this void state have a recollection of this encounter with nothingness. This is, in effect, constructing the void into an artificial object of knowledge. Hence, it is not the universal singular subject, because that can never be reduced to an object. Plus, it's making what is not into something which is. The experience of the void is not liberation in the tantric view. The state in which this category of experience occurs is identified by the poet as being akin to deep sleep. Thus, it is one of the three modes of consciousness and not the fourth state, or turiya, upon which these other states are predicated. The reason is not the fourth state, because the experience is relating to an outward state, the void, and has not been absorbed into the self. Verses 14 through 16. Quote, "Of this Spanda principle, two states are spoken about, viz., of the doer, or the subject, and the deed, or the object. Of these two, the deed, or the object, is subject to decay, but the doer, or the subject, never vanishes. In the samadhi of void, the effort which is directed towards objectivity disappears. It is only a fool who, on the disappearance of the effort, thinks, 'I have ceased to be.' There can never be the disappearance of that inner state which is the abode of the attribute of omniscience in the event of the non-perception of anything objective." End quote. These verses continue with the previous subject, as well as touching upon one of the classic subjects of Indian thought. I am not the doer, God is the doer. In its most fundamental form, the teaching is that Lord Shiva is the true doer of all activity, and the ego is a cipher which appropriates to itself the divine activity. We have become deluded when we embrace the illusion that we are acting completely independently. The empirical ego, also called traditionally the bound jiva, is able to perform the five functions of the Supreme Lord, which are creation, preservation, destruction, the revelation and concealment of grace, in a limited manner. This forms the basis for the ability to choose. Because of these abilities, the biographical or empirical ego comes to believe it alone is the locus of activity. In the tantric text, The Secret of Self-Recognition, this is seen as the very definition of the human condition. Quote, "To be a samsarin, one who is bound to the wheel of reincarnation, means being deluded by one's own power because of the ignorance of that authorship of the fivefold acts." Unquote. The late Professor Mishra frames the obvious question which this doctrine elicits, and I am sure most watching this are asking at this moment. If God is the real doer and the individual is only a camouflage, then the responsibility for evil falls on God. How can the ego be responsible if it is not the doer? Lord Krishna gives an answer to this which only seems to add to the confusion. In the Bhagavad Gita, he tells Arjuna, quote, "The Lord does not accept sin or even merit from anyone. Wisdom is veiled by ignorance, by which creatures are deluded." Unquote. Sin is not caused by the absolute Lord. It is caused by the ignorance who engage in such activity. The classic example of this is a drunk who mistakes poison for nectar. Or, to use a more modern example, one who drinks products which contain aspartame. The late Professor Mishra gives the analogy of a father and a college student. The father gives the student money to cover costs of his education and housing, but if the student spends this on beer, then the fault is not with the father. We have a limited ability to act, and if we use this to push ourselves deeper into impurity, then the Lord is not at fault. It is our responsibility and our karma. There are three components to this thesis. 1. The power of the biographical ego to act from willful, voluntary action, while limited, comes from the divine. In itself, the empirical ego is powerless to act without the energy of Spanda. 2. The Supreme Lord may prompt empirical egos to act in specific ways through a variety of means, such as engineering situations and the influence of the planets to seize the mind, to act in ways which will reap the fruits of karma. 3. When the individual follows his own transitory will, he will be subject to error. However, surrendering to the divine will frees one from this. To return to the verses more directly, this is here asserting that the divine appears in two aspects which can fundamentally be labeled as subject and object. In the Buddhist analysis, at the point of liberation, both these vanish and there is nothingness. In the Tantric view, for reasons we have seen, the subject, which is the inner nature of man, cannot undergo decay or change, and it is only the transitory flow of objects blinking in and out of existence as the permutations of the flow of divine energy, which vanish with the energy one uses to attain liberation. Verse 17. Quote, "The fully enlightened has, always and incessantly, the undeviating knowledge of the self in all the three states. The other one, which is the partially enlightened yogi, has it only at the beginning and end of each state." Unquote. The first part of these verses is straightforward. An individual who has fully self-recognized as Shiva operates from this vantage point continually. Instead of his focus being from the ego, the body, or even the flow of prana or chi, as they manifest through the three states, it is continually in the fourth state of Turiya. He experiences the sensory input from the body and the translation of experience from the biographical ego, but he is beyond them. Cognitive versus existential knowledge. The partially enlightened yogi is one who has some experience of the essential self, or the subject of Spanda, according to Singh. What does this term experienced and the quantifier some mean? Experience is not here defined as a cognitive set of axioms or propositions held in the chatter of the empirical mind. even if it is valid. This does not bring one to self-recognition. I may be knowledgeable of all the technical details associated with pomegranate gelato, and may be able to calculate the calories, list ingredients, outline the process of how the product is made, but that is not the same type of knowledge as eating it. The experience of eating the pomegranate gelato is the integral awareness of it. This secondary knowledge is not unimportant, the cognitive, because if we do not know there is such a dessert, we could never go and buy it. In the same manner, here we are learning what we are able to about the I consciousness in an effort to move towards self-recognition. But self-recognition is existential knowledge, and this has its source in grace. One question based on these verses would be, how does one remain focused from the fourth state of consciousness permanently? We might expect that this is reducible to one word, discipline. In fact, we would be half right in that it is reducible to one word, but it is not the one we expect. Swami Laksmanjoo, in his commentary on the second part of the Shiva Sutra, verse 10, informs us that that single word we are seeking is the one we have seen is the source of the existential knowledge of self-recognition, grace. One should not lose sight of the fact that this is not a mechanical, psychological process. These are phenomena of consciousness expressed in various modes. It is not simply a matter of writing the right code in the software of the psyche or turning the crank to stir prana or chi enough to reach liberation completely on one's own. One final point remains from these verses, and that is regarding the cryptic statement that the partially enlightened yogi only experiences the divine at the beginning and end of the three states of material consciousness. In yogic thought, it is understood that there are slight gaps between the thoughts which compromise the activity of inner mental chatter. When our monkey brain is hopping and swinging around the branches of thoughts, there are moments between which he is holding on to one branch or another, even though these are, to our initial perception, minuscule. It is through these gaps that one is able to pass through into the fourth state of Turiya, across which all of the mental activity is rolling. This applies to other aspects of both mind and body. There are many examples of practices for taking examples of these void zones given in the Vijnana Bhairava. For example, quote, O Bhairavi, by focusing one's awareness on the two voids at the end of the internal and the external breath, there the glorious form of Bhairava is revealed through Bhairavi or Shakti. In his comments on this practice, Swami Saraswati notes, quote, when these vayus, the breath, are restrained, at that moment there is a cessation of all activity and sense perception. The mind becomes steady and calm, as there are no ripples through the various layers of the energy body to disturb it. And in that stillness, the essence of Bhairava consciousness, which is not differentiated from Bhairavi, is experienced. Unquote. Pardon me. Verse 18. The all-pervading Lord, possessed of the supreme power in the form of knowledge, and knowable, the object of knowledge, appears in the two states of waking and dreams as knowledge and objects of knowledge, and in the other than these two only as consciousness." Unquote. In his commentary on the Shiva Sutra, Swami Laksmanjoo gives us some important details about the process of enlightenment, which are relevant for these verses. He said, quote, "If you meditate more and more and expand your awareness in meditation, then initially you will enter samadhi through the dreaming state, because the dreaming state is subtler than the waking state. Initially, you will never enter samadhi in the waking state." Unquote. Many watching may simply assume that this is a passive process, as is the common experience of dreaming. Dreams happen to us, and we must simply wait for such an experience. This is not necessarily the situation. In the West, many have written about the phenomena of lucid dreaming. This is when the dreamer becomes consciously aware while still in the dream state and is able to manipulate the mental environment. On a basic level, it enables the dreamer to communicate with the psychic fragments which appear as characters in the dream. It is also possible to change uncomfortable situations which occur in nightmares, especially those which are recurring, to different outcomes, and of course to interact with the nightmare characters to discover their true identity. It is a valid yogic technique to facilitate internal development, provided one does not become entangled with the phantasmagoria of possibilities. This is not always easy. For those who may be interested in learning more, I have provided links to interviews on this subject. These verses are teaching us that for the partially enlightened yogi, the Supreme Lord, or perhaps other assisting entities, may appear to him in their dreams in the forms to which they are devoted, as it is to say, using technical language, as an object. Perhaps a symbol as well. It is only in the more subtle states of deep sleep that he can encounter the abstraction of consciousness. Verses 19 and 20. Quote, "The particular emanation of Spanda, which began with the gunas, and which acquire their existence by having recourse to the generic Spanda, can never stand in the way of the one who has realized his essential nature. These gunas, etc., however, intent on veiling their real nature, push the people of unawakened intellect into the terrible ocean of transmigratory existence from which it is difficult to pull them out." Unquote. To translate the word gunas into English, Singh uses the highly technical term constitutive principles. This is a rather clumsy expression compared to the shorter word gunas, and this is such a common word in Sanskrit that the viewer should be familiar with it. Before proceeding, because of their centrality, we will briefly examine the gunas in Indian thought. There is a veritable encyclopedia of attributes to these three principles, but perhaps the most fundamental could be reduced to 1. Sattva, balance. 2. Rajas, activity. 3. Tamas, inertia. There is a tremendous amount of literature on this subject from the perspective of various schools of thought. I will try to be as elementary as I am able, but there is no doubt that there will be someone who will argue, and undoubtedly based on legitimate sources, with me even about these basic points. That's fine. People of goodwill can disagree without being disagreeable. Basically, the gunas are the modes of spanda in both the macrocosm and the microcosm. They are continually active as the deeper currents of the flow of spanda. Both nature and human psychology are complete reflections of their movement and manifestations. They do not exist in pure form. Such discussion is an abstraction. Also, all of them are necessary. There are some traditions which apply moral qualities to these principles and will strive to be in one state alone while eradicating the others. However, all exist in the universe and the field of human experience for a reason. One cannot be free of any one of them. The point is not to do the impossible and live in pure sattva, eradicating the other two. It is not to be attached to any of them and to transcend them all, including sattva. That can create impurity and hold one back too. Yes, you can be too holy. To return to the verses, there are two aspects of spanda. One is the general, and the other is the particular. The overarching is the power of consciousness, while the particular, three constitutive aspects form the objective experience which we encounter in daily life, arising from the interplay of the gunas in the holographic world of appearances about us as consensus reality, as well as within our personal psychological experiences. The majority of the human race and other etheric species consider these constitutive aspects to be distinct from consciousness. By failing to perceive the actual relationship, these individuals become entangled in them. This subject is spoken about by Lord Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita to a great extent. There he says, quote, "The three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, born of prakriti," that is Shakti in the tantric terms, "bind down the embodied imperishable dweller in the body," unquote. In his comments on this verse, the tantric sage Abhinavagupta notes that this is because they mistake the body for the Atman, or in our terms, the experient. Lord Krishna continues, quote, "When the seer perceives no other agent than the gunas and knows that which transcends the gunas, he merges into my being. When the embodied soul transcends these three gunas that spring from the body, he is free from birth, death, old age, and suffering, and attains immortality," unquote. In other words, this is self-recognition. Lord Krishna here points out that the path to liberation, which the poet says is difficult, is that to recognize that which transcends the constitutive principles of experience, the self, and to integrally know, in the words of the Upanishads, Tat Tvamasi, I am that. Verse 21, quote, "Therefore, one should be always on the alert for the discernment of the Spanda principle. Such a person attains his essential nature as Spanda, even in the waking condition, in a short time." Unquote. The suggestion of these verses is that the meditative experience is not an isolated section of time and space, but is an integral process of life. Meditation is about techniques. These are only tools and are used to discover the divine within us. In Tantra, the teaching is that we should optimally train ourselves to expand this search and this awareness into all aspects of our life. The reason is that all we experience is, in reality, Spanda. We need to only recognize it. One of my favorite verses of the Rig Veda teaches, quote, "He is Hamsa, the sun, dwelling in light. Vasu, the wind, dwelling in the firmament. The invoker of Devas, the Lord Agni, dwelling on the altar. The dweller among men as consciousness. The dweller in the most excellent orb, the sun, the dweller in truth. The dweller in the sky as air, born in the waters, in the rays of the light, in the variety of manifestations, in the eastern mountain, the truth itself." Unquote. The seers of the Vedas here teach that it is possible to perceive the manifestation of the divine in such common natural phenomena as the sun and wind, as well as philosophical abstractions such as truth, because, as they teach explicitly, he dwells among us as consciousness. Verse 22, quote, "In that state is the Spanda principle firmly established, to which a person is reduced when he is greatly exasperated or overjoyed, or is in impasse reflecting what to do, or is running for life." Unquote. One of the primary technical aims of yoga is to establish one-pointedness or hyperfocus. That is, metaphorically, to use the energy of our monkey mind compact into a laser beam on one thought. Generally, this is the result of practice over time. However, it can occur spontaneously. In the literature of Western psychology, this is seen in what are called peak experiences. The term was first coined by Maslow in his 1964 work, Religion, Values, and Peak Experiences. A more popular way of expressing this that I heard in the dojo was being in the zone. These states are defined by a specific set of traits: being fully engaged in an activity, detached from awareness of time and space, spontaneity, and oblivion to the influences of the past or concern for the future. One example we find in art is in Wagner's opera Tristan und Isolde. When the lovers sing in an iconic duet, quote, my translation, "Let us sink together into this night of love, forgetting that we live," unquote. By the surging energy of their emotional connection, the lovers lose awareness of all else except the experience, which dissolves their individual empirical egos and unites them in a transcendent love. In Wagner's operas, this ends in tragedy. not because the social order, here represented by King Mark, reasserts itself, as would be the usual interpretation of Wagner, but because they fail to recognize what this is and to maintain the connection to that higher state. They were unable to integrate it. The vector to the state is not restricted to what we would designate as positive experiences, much I'm sure to the dismay of New Agers. It can also be reached through states such as anger and intoxication. The reason is, again, that these two are manifestations of Spanda. The nature of the experience is social conditioning, and when we peel away the artificial constructs we impose on them, then we discover the nakedness of the energy as it really is. Admittedly, this is not an easy task. But this is the trick. It is why most people are carried away by these energies instead of learning how to surf them. They become, as the poet says, stupefied and drawn towards the external object generating the agitation rather than turning within to imbibe the raw emotion itself. This relates closely to a practice given in the Vijnana Bhairava. Quote, if one makes one's mind stable in the various states of desire, anger, greed, delusion, intoxication, or envy, then the reality alone will remain which is underlying them. Unquote. In his comments on this, Swami Laksmanjoo advises that it is critical to catch this rise in emotion just as the energy is gathering. If not, one will be overwhelmed. This is also one of the problems we can see with Wagner's characters. When the core focus and awareness of the mind is not agitated by this torrent, but takes control, it can be transmuted to, quote, transcendental God consciousness, unquote. I would point out these feelings are not condemned as sinful or negative, and there is no call to suppress or deny them, but to take control of them and use them as tools for development. Verses 23 through 25. Quote, taking firm hold of that, the Spanda, the awakened yogi remains firm with the resolution, I will surely carry out whatever it will tell me. Resting on the experience of the Spanda, both prana, surya, and aprana, chandra, get merged into susumna, and by the upward path of susumna, the middle channel, they rise up to the greater ether of universal consciousness by abandoning the sphere of the body together with the Brahmarandra and are completely dissolved in it. There, the unenlightened yogi, by considering that state a kind of deep sleep, remains stupefied, while the other one, who is not covered with the darkness of infatuation, is established in that ether of universal consciousness and abides as fully enlightened. Unquote. These verses touch upon aspects of Kriya Yoga practices which are used to manipulate the internal energy field of the human body, the prana, to place one in a state where one is more open to the grace to fully enter these altered states. These techniques are not given in their entirety by the poet. He seems more to be referring to them on the assumption that the reader is familiar with such disciplines. I feel this is beyond an introductory study and will leave these verses without further comment. But for the interested, I will post a link to an instructor of Kriya Yoga who knows more than I and can offer more effective guidance and instruction, and this would be the Vedic astrologer Ryan Kurzak. And while I don't know him and he does not know me, I certainly recommend subscribing to both of his channels. The text, Section 2, verses 1 and 2, quote, resorting to that power, the Spanda Tattva, the devas, mantras, etc., together with the sacred formulae which serve as their indicators, being endowed with the power of omniscience, proceed to carry out their assigned functions toward the embodied ones, just as the senses of the embodied ones, by resorting to the power of the Spanda, proceed to carry out their specific functions. Freed of all limitations of office after having performed their assigned duties, their denotation as particular deities or devas having ceased, they get dissolved together with the mind of their devotees in that very Spanda principle. Hence, they are of the nature of Shiva. Unquote. The word mantra is often used with a double meaning. It refers to the devas themselves as manifestations of consciousness and energy, as well as their related sound vibrations as the mantras one chants in meditation. These are intimately connected. The verses teach us that both are ultimately emanations of Lord Shiva because their being and activities arise from the substratum of Spanda. When this particular universe is finally dissolved, they will fold back into Spanda and bring their devotees with them into the primeval source. One of the critiques often leveled against the missionary Abrahamic faiths is the inherent injustice of torturing human beings in hell who simply did not hear of either Jesus or Allah. In Indian thought, the devotees of what we might call in Western terminology the pagan gods go to them and receive the boons they are able given their personal merits. In fact, however, these are often masks for Lord Shiva, whom they are approaching in that form. We find this teaching echoed in the Bhagavad Gita. Quote, to the devas go their devotees, and to ancestors their devotees. Those devoted to ghost go to ghost, but my devotees come to me. Unquote. Lord Krishna's advice is certainly sensible to go directly to the source, but those who do not recognize this and follow their own paths of devotion to their end will ultimately, according to the poet, return to the source, which is the self. This was actually the original view of the Christian church when Origen was the dominant theologian, and was only changed under the influence of Augustine in the 4th century AD. Verses 3 and 4. Quote, since the limited individual self is identical with the whole universe, inasmuch as all entities arise from him, and because of the knowledge of all subjects, pardon me, he is the feeling of identity with them all, whether in the word, object, or thought. There is no state that is not Shiva. It is the experient himself who, always and everywhere, abides in the form of the experienced, i.e., it is the divine himself who is the essential experient, and it is he who abides in the form of the universe as his field of experience. Unquote. The poet of the Spanda Karikas often repeats this core teaching echoed in the Upanishads as "you are that." Essentially, there is no distinction between the bound soul operating in the body through the biographical ego from the supreme reality within us as the experient. The individual is identical with all existence. The distinctions are illusions of impurity. Writing of his experiences in the inspiration of a poem, which is the Surge of Spanda, Rilke conveys this to us, saying, quote, "Breathing, you invisible poem, complete. Interchange of our own essence with world space, you counterweight in which I rhythmically happen. Single wave motion whose gradual sea I am. You, most inclusive of all possible seas, space grown warm. How many regions of space have already been inside me? There are winds that seem like my wandering suns. Do you recognize me, air full of places I once absorbed? You who were the smooth bark, roundless, and leaf of my words." Unquote. The medium of the poetic inspiration as an eddy of Spanda in the poem is expressed as the single wave motion. The poet perceives a shift in his perceptions as an interchange of his own essence with the universal. Thus he discovers the many regions of space in the depths of his own inner sea. This is the footprint of the experient. Verse 5, quote, "Or he who has this realization, which is the identity of his self with the whole universe, being constantly united with the divine, views the entire world as the play of the self identical with Shiva, and is liberated while alive. There is no doubt about this." Unquote. Pardon me. One effect of self-recognition is to burn away all the seeds, roots, stems, and fruits of all past karma. This includes the good as well as the bad karma. All is dissolved because one is no longer attached to the fruits of action. One does not need to be removed from the physical realm for this to happen. It can happen if the yogi is alive through the grace of the Supreme Shakti, which brings one to Lord Shiva. The poet makes a point of emphasizing the claim that it is possible to be liberated while alive. This is not a promise of a distant heaven. At this level of experience, the world becomes lila, or play. One example we see of this in the Puranic literature is the play of Lord Krishna in his youth. There is no austerity there, but it is important to express that it was not a 1990s rave, which I guess shows my age, either. This arises spontaneously from a Lagrangian point between the two countervailing forces, hence beyond their duality. Quote, Yoga is not for him who eats too much, nor for him who does not eat at all from fasting, O Arjuna. It is not for him who is in the habit of sleeping too much, nor for him who keeps awake in long vigils. To him who is moderate in food and play, moderate in performing actions, moderate in sleep and waking, for him is the yoga which destroys sorrow. Unquote. I'm reminded of a quote of Cicero's in the Orations, specifically I think book 1, that quote, "Moderation is the knowledge of putting whatever we say or do in its proper place," unquote. However, in reality, the Roman statement is the opposite to that of the Bhagavad Gita. This is because the proper place is defined by social propriety outside of the individual. Remember, Cicero's ideal virtue is duty to the state, like a good fascist, Marxist, or neocon. But Lord Krishna is speaking of the emergence of a spontaneous harmony from within the liberated heart of the individual. Verses 6 and 7. Quote, "This only is the manifestation of the object of meditation in the meditator's mind, that the aspirant with resolute will has the realization of his identity with that object of meditation. This alone is the acquisition of ambrosia leading to immortality. This alone is the realization of the self. This alone is the initiation of liberation, leading to identify with Shiva." Unquote. It is an axiom of Kashmir Shaivism that, we worship Shiva by becoming Shiva. When one engages in meditative techniques or religious rites, this should be the overarching principle. Whether it is a mantra that is chanted or visualization of an image, this is done in the final analysis as a tool of self-recognition. Offerings and mantras to the devas for specific aims will bear fruits and have a role in our lives if properly understood, but this is transient. This is why the poet tells us that the true religious initiation is to see beyond this to the source and recognize that we are that very source. This applies to all rites and all religions, not just to those of Hinduism or of the East. Quote, "Better that yajna, performed exclusively by various materials, is the yajna of knowledge." Unquote. The material rites that we perform or participate in are an outward reflection of an inner truth. They are the nexus of the macrocosm and the microcosm. If we remain attached only to the outward results, then we are missing the true import of them and their true function, which is to bring us to that realization of which the poet spoke. The ambrosia one drinks or internalizes is the knowledge of non-duality. That is because that which shatters the impurities which bind our consciousness and trick us into believing that we are only a contracted state is that knowledge. In the Vedas, the soma is associated not only with the plant used in rituals, but also this ambrosia. This is the internal yogic soma, which is consciousness. The 4 types of practice. This would be an optimum place to make some brief comments about what are called the four practices of Kashmir Shaivism to bring us to that internal place where we can experience the final goal of self-recognition, which is beyond the limited world of consensus reality in which we live. While they may be presented hierarchically, this is not meant to reflect a ladder of practice that one is to climb, nor does it reflect relative value. The only value is what will bring one to liberation, and any one of these types of practices is able to produce such a result. Ultimately, an individual will gravitate towards one type of practice, and while fine, it is considered the best to, in some way, include them all as much as possible. Don't sell yourself short. That is, of course, only generating more of the impurity that binds you. This can be very much of a catch-22, believe me. And that's why there's grace. We will briefly look at the four practices from the relative highest to the lowest, and give some specific techniques representing them from the Vijnana Bhairava without details of explanation due to considerations of time. 1. No means. The first type of practice is that which involves no type of action, either internal or external at all. It is simple realization arising from integral knowledge that is simply given. Even the statement of the exercises given as examples are, in effect, after the fact. I do not need to say, I am speaking right now, to be aware of that fact. Such a statement simply reflects what is. That is the nature of these types of practices. Examples. Quote, all the world is without reality like a magic show. For what reality is there to a magic show? By firmly thinking in this way, one obtains peace, unquote. And, quote, there is neither bondage nor liberation for me. They are just like bogies for the fearful. This world is a reflection in the mind, just as the sun is reflected on the waters, unquote. 2. High means. This is the path to intuitively uncover the divine as all manifestations. Here one peels away not only the layers of artificial constructs imposed on the movement of the spandas, but the gunas themselves. Examples. Quote, one should concentrate on the state where sleep has not yet come, but the external awareness has disappeared between waking and sleeping. There, the Supreme Goddess will reveal herself. And the second one, if one makes one's mind stable in the various states of desire, anger, greed, delusion, intoxication, or envy, the reality alone will remain which is underlying them. And the third one, quote, wherever the mind goes, whether outside or within, there itself is the state of Shiva. Since he is all-pervading, where else could the mind go? Unquote. 3. Medium means. The middle way is a way of knowledge. The aim is to psychologically reorient the individual away from diversity to unity. This is done through reflection and various types of meditation, both active and passive. Examples. 1. In the same way, if one concentrates one's awareness on anything, be it an empty space, a wall, or a worthy disciple, this energy of concentration will merge by itself and bestow grace. Also, by fixing one's mind on the inner space of the skull and sitting motionless with the eyes closed, gradually, by the stability of the mind, one attains the supreme goal. The final exercise: one should meditate on the body as only enclosed by skin with nothing inside. Meditating in this way, one attains the one who cannot be meditated upon. 4. Low means. These are techniques and practices which involve the body and prana or chi. Under this class fall all of the religious rituals, such as the worship of the Shiva lingam, which I highly recommend, as well as Kriya Yoga and occult techniques, such as those taught by Robert Bruce with his New Energy Ways, which involve the manipulation of the human energy field. More emotional practices, such as ecstatic chant or singing, also fall under this class, as do the chanting of mantras to the devas. This concludes part 2 of the Spanda Karikas, and I do so encourage all of those who watch this to begin to use these or other practices as frequently as possible, if not daily. One does not need to be seated in meditation or spend time churning prana. It can be as simple as walking down the street and using your imagination to see the world as a magic show. Be creative and make these practices your own. Thank you very much. Goodbye.